Now, Nigeria's infrastructure deficit remains a critical challenge to economic growth, with an estimated $100 billion needed annually to close the gap. According to the African Development Bank, from dilapidated roads and bridges to inadequate rail, ports and urban transport systems, poor infrastructure limits trade, stifles productivity, and isolates communities, particularly in rural areas where nearly 50% of Nigerians reside. While initiatives like the Sukuk issuance have funded 124 road projects spanning 5,820 kilometers since its inception in 2017, systemic issues such as funding constraints, project delays, and maintenance gaps persist. As the government and private sector stakeholders seek to address this challenge, we ask, what are the most effective strategies for bridging Nigeria's infrastructure gaps, and what role can innovative financing models such as Sukuk issuances play in supporting infrastructure development? And how can we ensure that infrastructure projects are prioritized, executed, and maintained in a way that maximizes their impact on the economy and improves the lives of Nigerians? Now, joining me in the studio to share his expertise and insights on these critical questions is Professor Uche Walike, Professor of Capital Market, Nasarawa State University, and also President, Capital Market Academics of Nigeria. You're welcome to Business Express.
Thanks so much, Musa.
Okay, to begin with, we would like you, Prof, to somehow assess the current state of road infrastructure in Nigeria for us.
Well, it's something that is obvious, even to the, to the blind. The state of infrastructure generally, not just roads, you can also talk about rail, ports. Okay, it's way below where it ought to be, considering the size of the country's economy, considering the population of the economy. Infrastructure stock to GDP in Nigeria is as low as 35%, and which is one of the least in sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa, for example, has as high as over 80%. So that tells you that there is huge infrastructure gap, in this country, that must be plugged one way or the other.
Okay. Now, the federal government recently launched a 300 billion naira sovereign Sukuk issuance to accelerate the pace of infrastructural development across the country. Can you explain to us what Sukuk is and how it differs from the traditional bond financing?
Yeah, thank you very much. Sukuk is simply a special type of bond that is issued by, of course, it can also be issued by corporate bodies and also the government to raise money specifically for, capital projects. The major difference between a Sukuk and the conventional bond is the fact that Sukuk is asset-backed and also asset-based. When we say Sukuk is asset-backed, it also means that the proceeds from Sukuk are usually tied to projects. Sukuk has an underlying asset. So investors in Sukuk don't earn interest. Of course, I also need to mention that Sukuk is the type of bond that complies with Sharia principles in the sense that interest is not paid on it. And of course, proceeds from Sukuk are not used for activities that promote non-permissible areas like alcohol, promoting alcohol or gambling and so on. So Sukuk is, as I said earlier on, asset-backed. So the returns that investors earn are simply, from the underlying assets that back up Sukuk. So essentially, that is the major difference between a Sukuk and a conventional. Conventional bonds are not asset-backed. When the government raises or issues a conventional bond, the process can be used for anything. in the name of financing budget deficit. But once you are dealing with Sukuk, you are sure that the proceeds, go to finance one infrastructure project, or the other.
Okay. Now, what makes it an ideal model for financing infrastructure
Absolutely,
projects?
absolutely. Makes it an ideal. That is an ideal instrument for financing infrastructure, in the country, because, as I said, you're sure that it is the processes are ring-fenced and the processes are meant for infrastructure. Since we started issuing Sukuk in Nigeria, sovereign Sukuk by the FG in 2017, of course, proceeds have been used to finance roads. In other climes, in South Africa, for example, in Kenya, these countries too have been issuing Sukuk. The UK too also issues Sukuk. I'm deliberate about mentioning these countries. Remember, these countries are not Muslim countries per se. They have also been using Sukuk to fund their infrastructure projects. Of course, in countries that are known to be predominantly Muslim countries like Malaysia, Sukuk has played a very prominent role in the financing of projects. So it is, it bears repeating that is one very good way to finance road projects, as we are currently doing in Nigeria, which is also why I would want to see a situation in which, going forward, the size of the Sukuk, is increased.
That's just what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
But despite the ideal model, but the market size is still small.
Yes, it's still small. When we first entered, remember the first time it was just 100 billion. What we have now, 300 billion, well, represents an improvement, but it's still small. If you look at the domestic debt stock of Nigeria today, the latest figure by the Debt Management Office, as at September 30th, 2024, what you find is that the total debt stock is about 142 trillion naira, out of which the domestic component is about 74 trillion. Now, out of that 74 trillion, it's just 1 trillion, 999 billion, around 1 trillion, okay, that you find there as outstanding Sukuk. If you add this one we have just done now, so that gives you just 1.3 trillion, which is very small, which is less than 2%, okay, of the total domestic stock we have done. So the size is small to make any impact, and that is why today it's not surprising that we are still having this infrastructure challenge. If we can, scale up the Sukuk issuances, all right, given the governance mechanisms, around Sukuk. By the way, Sukuk has very strong governance mechanisms. I just gave you a hint that when you raise money from Sukuk, you can't divert such proceeds. It must be used specifically for for projects. So in view of that, I would advise that going forward, more emphasis should be placed on, instruments, such as Sukuk and other infrastructure bonds. As a matter of fact, if you're going forward, the country should place more emphasis on infrastructure bonds in order to reduce the debt burden that we have in this country. In countries like Kenya, for example, I cited Kenya earlier on, railway bonds are common. In Nigeria, we have not done anything like railway bond. So when you do an infrastructure bond, again, you're sure the proceeds are ring-fenced, the proceeds are going to a specific infrastructure. In Nigeria today, the bulk of what we have issued by way of bond is FGM bond. And FGM bond represents over 78% of the total domestic debt stock. And when FGM bonds are issued and the money comes, the government is free, to use the money for whatever, which is why it's also dangerous. You may have a government that is on board today, that is very disciplined, but tomorrow that may not be the case. That is why it's good when you want to borrow, you use the right instrument to borrow. The same thing can also be said with respect to external debt. External debt stock, unfortunately for us, again, we seem to also be relying on instruments with discretionary feature, such as Eurobonds. We have spent a lot of emphasis on Eurobonds, which again, I think, shouldn't be if we are really serious about, developing our infrastructure stock. So for external loans, I would advise we do more of, multilateral, concessional long-term, as opposed to Eurobonds, again, that have this discretionary feature, you can't specifically tie proceeds to projects. So,
okay. Now, the school has funded like around 124 road projects since we started it in 2017. Now, how successful would you say this particular funding model has? I mean, how successful has it been in somehow closing Nigeria's
yes,
infrastructure
well, to a
gap?
large extent.
And what indicators should we use to measure, the progress?
Yes, to a large extent, I would say it's been successful. Yes, if you drive around this country today, if you will see, signposts bearing, Sukuk. So the thing is there for you to see. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the impact, okay, is still not significant, partly because of the size. The size is very small, so it's still like a drop in an ocean. All right, but even the little that we have seen by way of Suku, that is what you find. The evidence is, you see dotting, across the 6 geopolitical zones in the country. So imagine if this were to be scaled up. If we had, for example, instead of the 1 trillion that I talked about now, we are doing like 10 trillion, 15 trillion, in Sukuk size. Again, not only by the FG, even by states, even when states are borrowing, they're also doing infrastructure bonds. By now, the story would be a lot more different.
Okay, when talking about financial inclusion through Sukuk, how can government boost retail participation or investor participation in Sukuk, and what role does public awareness now play?
Yes. It's by, that's why I'm happy that you're doing this program, which is also, part of it, is by creating that awareness. I remember when I started, I cited examples, and I was deliberate about it, correcting an impression that the, Sukuk is just meant for a certain segment of, the population. It's actually meant for, every investor. That's because of the many benefits that are associated with Sukuk. One of which is the fact that, number one, I've talked about the fact that it is ring-fenced. So when you are investing in Sukuk, you're also contributing to the development of the economy, because you're sure of where the money is going to be put. Part of the governance mechanisms is also the oversight that comes with Sukuk. There is the Financial Regulation Advisory Council of Experts, that also ensures that proceeds from Sukuk are not diverted. So to that extent, you can say that Sukuk has a great deal of accountability and transparency, around it. So the awareness should, continue. People should get to know that Sukuk is part of what they should, be part of. Look at the minimum investment, just 10,000 naira. I'm sure it's also an effort to ensure, inclusivity, to ensure that as many people as possible participate in Sukuk. Sukuk also does not attract any form of tax, unlike conventional bonds, where you returns from conventional bonds, which of course come by way of interest, suffer withholding tax. Okay, Sukuk does not suffer withholding tax, does not suffer capital gains tax, so it is completely, tax-free, so there are many benefits associated with, Sukuk on the part of the, investor, and of course on the part of the issuer to the same thing applies. So it's a win-win situation, both for the issuer and for the person invested. The investor is also guaranteed of stable, predictable returns. So every 6 months returns are paid, and what is also more important is the fact that the credit risk is near zero, because Sukuk is backed by the full faith of the federal government, the sovereign Sukuk, full faith of the federal government, so it's guaranteed. All right, and it's also something, as I said, one can invest and hope to get returns, because you're sure your returns are not coming just by way of interest, but it's coming from, rental income from the underlying asset that the, Sukuk proceeds are funding.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Uche Owaleke, President, Capital Market Academics of Nigeria. You know, the time is before I realize it. You know, we've exhausted
Thank you.
much.
Thank you, Musa,
Well,
for
thank you
inviting
for
me.
sharing your thought with us.
Thank you very much.